Welcome to Socrates in the Studio. Today, my guest will be Michael Wilkerson. We discussed his book, Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. Here it is. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Great to be with you.
You do a lot, you write a lot, stormwall.org, is it?
Stormwall.com.
Stormwall.com. But I want to talk to you today. You wrote a book, we have a copy here, called Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. I read the book, Why America Matters, and I was mightily impressed at your ability to tell what's essentially the history of the United States in a way that helps us see not just why America matters and why America is unavoidably exceptional, but how that should help us process the present moment. So I want to talk to you, start at the beginning. What led you to take on this monumental project? Why did you write Why America Matters?
Anger, I think, and I say that facetiously, but I think over the last few years, there was a growing proverbial fire in the bones. There was this recognition that we as a country, as a nation, as a people had gone so far away from what I think America was about and should be about, that I felt almost compelled to write it. It turned out to be, as you pointed out, a much bigger, broader work than I had ever imagined. And I am not a author, journalist by background. I spent most of my career in business and finance. I'd been on Wall Street for a decade. In the decade leading up to the lockdowns and pandemic 2020, I was running a company investing in businesses in Africa, mostly in food security, energy security. So I had only begun to write in 2020, when all of a sudden, lockdowns, travel restrictions, I can't do the commuter flight to Nairobi or Johannesburg anymore, and I have to actually start to pay attention, not to African politics, which I had gotten to know quite a bit, but to what was happening here in my own country. And what struck me in 2020 was how different the country felt, how different the dialogue felt, how different things felt. And I began to write op-eds, just simple contributing to various journals or publications, starting out with a business or economic perspective, what I knew, but the impact of lockdowns, what I saw happening. But the more I began to dig in, and the more my then teenage sons began to ask me very hard questions about what was going on around us, did I start to do my own research, start to dig in more deeply. And I think for the first time in my life, I came to a strong conviction that fake news was real, that what was happening around us was not an accident, that there was a conspiracy of misinformation, of propaganda, of censorship, that the more I dug, the more I realized was much, much worse than I ever imagined possible.
And it is, I mean, let's be honest, it was for anybody very difficult to process. You don't want to think that what you fear could conceivably be true is actually true. And I think that there are people I'm sure listening right now who are at different places on the continuum. But I think it's because it is so disturbing to think that in the United States of America this could be happening, or to think that we have actually drifted so far from our roots, from the founders' vision. Because the question why America matters, you're presupposing that there is such a thing as America, that there's an idea, that it's not, in other words, if there weren't this ideal of America, then why America, you couldn't ask the question why America matters. So you have to ask what is America to understand, or to, you have to ask, what is America, to understand, is there such a thing as America? And that's really what you do in the book. I mean, the first part of the book is the history, and it really is just so beautifully done. One of the reasons that I recommend it to people is because you tell our history very beautifully, succinctly, to the extent that it can be told succinctly. But let's go through it, because you did determine, when you are asking the question, is America exceptional, or how have we drifted from the idea of exceptionalism, we have to kind of go back. But before we do that,
Yeah.
was there an inciting incident for you? Was it, do you remember when President Obama was asked whether America is exceptional, and he gave a very tortured kind of answer? I thought that was a moment. That was a big deal. That was a milestone in America, to have the American president unable clearly to say, yes, we are exceptional, here's why. Did that hit you at the time, or did it hit you more recently?
It hit me at the time, and then I moved on because I was busy with other things. And it was interesting, even President Trump, as candidate Trump in 2016, didn't necessarily embrace the idea. He kind of said, well, I never really liked the term. And from candidate Trump to President Trump, and certainly by his fourth year of his first term, it had shifted quite a bit, where he was embracing the idea that no, and I think part of what was happening for him and for me, making a distinction between the United States as a country, as a nation state, and America as a nation, as a people, as an idea, as you said. And what fascinated me about talking about why America matters and the idea of exceptionalism was the idea that America is a special place. Goes all the way back to the very first generation of settlers, the Puritans, the Pilgrims, and others. And John Winthrop, who was the captain of the ship that came over starting the Massachusetts Bay Colony Company, basically expressed this idea that whatever we're doing, and we don't know what it is yet, the eyes of the world are upon us, because we're trying to create something new that hasn't existed before, a place of religious freedom, of political freedom. And he quoted Jesus to say, we can be as a city on a hill, a shining example. But if we fail, the eyes of the world are also upon us, and we will be a byword, a mockery among the nations of the world. And that theme is something, as a metaphor, the city on a hill, that I open the book with and start and talk about how all the way from Kennedy to Reagan and then eventually to President Trump embraced this idea that we are a city on a hill, that there is something extraordinary about the history of America. And you can talk about, let's say, exceptionalism in the sense that the largest country in the world, all the natural resources, it is that, but it's so much more. It goes to the foundational ideas that were unique, or at least unpracticed at the time, unprecedented.
I don't think we want to leave people with the idea that this was all settled, until recent times. In other words, that you can go back in our own history and you can trace, whether it was whether people were identifying as Americans with with Jamestown or with Plymouth or with the Boston Bay Colony. You see that, and nobody saw more clearly the exceptionalism of America than President Lincoln. We're sitting in a room here surrounded by Lincoln memorabilia. Lincoln, and I wrote about this in my book, if you can keep it, but he really dramatically understood this idea. He was the one that initiated the idea of Thanksgiving. I mean, to look back to Plymouth as this founding moment in this idea that was to become America. And so you have that working its way through our history, and of course we've had people that have gotten it and not gotten it, but Lincoln to me is a really, really key figure. But of course, the idea of American exceptionalism and America on the founders' model really basically held sway. I mean, you have obviously Reagan making his point about it, but it's what caused you to write the book, of course, is that it's come under particular attack in recent years, and I want to talk about that. But I also want to talk about your telling of the history, because it's really like Why America Matters: The Case for New Exceptionalism. It's really two books. The first book is the history, and then you go on. But I love your telling of it. Can we dilate for a minute on some of the moments?
Yeah, and so you've said a number of things that really caught my attention. Is that one of the things that began to happen around the first half of the 19th century was this realization that an identity was coalescing around Puritan New England, around the ideals that had come out of that. There has always been a tension in American history, let's call it, between the Puritan founding and, you alluded to it, the Jamestown founding of 1619, which was purely commercial, it was purely about the slave trade and commerce, where what was happening in New England was about religious liberty. It was about leaving a place of political persecution, of economic depression and all sorts of things, of wars, religious persecution. The Pilgrims had been wandering around to the Netherlands and everywhere else trying to find a place to be able to practice freely. And even, you mentioned the era of Lincoln, so by the time of the Civil War, one of the most fascinating characters that I really discovered as I was researching Why America Matters was Frederick Douglass. This gentleman, born a slave, taught himself to read, escaped, freed, went north, and eventually becomes this prophetic voice to America. A man who, as a young man, was angry at the country, rightly so, because of the injustice done to him, but eventually becomes a true patriot, someone who was, as he read and discovered the ideals of the country, the foundational ideas, the ideas embedded in the Declaration of Independence, that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable God-given rights that could not be taken away or abridged by any government. Frederick Douglass begins to speak in the 1830s, that's a little early, 1840s, 1850s, about the coming catastrophe and identifying slavery as the issue that would eventually come right, because in God's eternal justice, it could not stand. It was immoral. And if there were a God in heaven, then slavery would have to be righted. But the danger was that it was only going to be righted through bloodshed. Douglass said, a patriot, a true lover of his country, is one who rebukes and does not excuse the sins of the nation.
I turned right to the page when you were talking. I remember that you begin the book with a number.
Maybe you can read it
no,
better,
you begin the book with a number of epigrams, one by Tocqueville, one Montesquieu, the book of Proverbs, and then Frederick Douglass. No, you quoted it correctly. You said, he is the lover of his country who rebukes and does not excuse its sins. That's biblical definition of what it is to love and to bless, right? And it seems that somebody like Frederick Douglass, he got it right, but that idea has been perverted so that you have people now who accuse the nation of its sins, but don't ever seem to want them to be righted. They seem to be in love with making the accusation for its own sake, in a sense, damning the country, rather than loving and blessing the country, damning the country without the hope that it could return to its ideals. Whereas Douglass is a figure who he didn't shrink from the criticism, but he clearly believed, as did Dr. King, that we were obliged to repent, obliged to go back to where we had started.
The idea being, was slavery an original idea, or was it an aberration of the ideas of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence? Frederick Douglass, rightly, I believe, comes out to the side that says this was an aberration. This is a cancer on the body politic and social. It is not inherent to, it is a contradiction of. And his ability to affirm that, and once again, to make a distinction between government or policy and the values and foundational ideas of a nation. Today, we face the same issue. You, I, others are, at the moment, critical of government policy, of things that the current administration or others have done over time, that is different than another form of attack, which is the ideological attack by people who do not love this country, who do not have its best interests at heart, who would like to see the experiment fail and for this country to become something else. There's differences in motivation, differences in approach, but I would say that part of it has been, part of the attack has been to confuse the ideas of, is patriotism even a good thing? Is nationalism a good thing? Is it okay to love your country? And we have been, we'll talk about perhaps later the broader ideological attack, but that's certainly been one of them, has been to make Americans feel somewhat ashamed of who they are, of who their country is, to be ashamed of its history. Now, it's hard to be proud of your history if you actually don't know it. And one of the problems I identify in this book is that we're in this massive generational shift where, starting with the millennials, but especially then as you go to Gen Z and younger, that they are simply not being taught their own history, they're not being taught civics. If they're being taught a history of America, it is a completely distorted view. They're not being told the truth. They're being taught a propagandized version based on postmodernism, based on critical theory, and Marxism, an underlying desire to undermine the foundations of our nation.
Right, and your argument is not just that it's an alternative vision of what America is and has been, but it's actually genuinely wrong. And so the first part of your book, you tell the true story, in a sense, of America and of why that would lead us to think that there is such a thing as America, why there's an ideal, and why it actually matters, why we shouldn't burn it down, but why we should restore it to the original vision. So let's go a little bit through the history. I mean, you started with Winthrop in the 17th century, but talk us a little bit through the history. And I know you write about Jackson at some point, but what are some of the high points?
And slow me down if I'm going too fast is a question, because I know we have a limited amount of time. There's a lot of content in here, but what I would say is that think about, so we start with that Puritan era, Winthrop, this is 1600s. New England, there's also some settlements in Virginia and elsewhere, as we've talked about. And over the next 100 years, you see a real development of the states with individual identities growing. And then something interesting happens in the mid-1700s, in the 18th century, something we call now the Great Awakening. Well, there's this, for the next generation that hadn't come to America, they're now second or third generation. They had lost a little bit of that religious motivation and fervor. But then there's the so-called Great Awakening, this massive revival and reflection of the importance of religion in public life. And all of these commentators, you mentioned Tocqueville, but others, German, Charles Dickens from the UK, who would come, and common thread for all of them is this amazement at how important religion and faith was in public life.
Because it wasn't the case.
It was
in
no
Europe,
longer,
and they noticed it.
It was no longer.
And because religion was established in Europe, they weren't used to seeing it run free. And to see it run free, I mean, Tocqueville marveled at it. They all marvel at it because it is pretty distinctly American.
So you have that. You have the Great Awakening, the spiritual revival, at the same moment where in Europe, all the ideals of the Enlightenment are really coming into fruition, into maturity, and those ideals are making their way across the pond, across the Atlantic. And those ideals in the Enlightenment had to do with things like the idea of liberty, the ideas that individuals had rights, that sovereignty was vested not in a monarch, not in the political power, but in the people. In Europe, those ideas did not mix very well. The French Revolution, contemporaneous with ours, was extremely bloody. The battle between republicanism and monarchy and history, including religion, was to sever any ties with religion. But that doesn't happen in America. Something different happens. Somehow there's this beautiful harmony between the Enlightenment ideals, Scottish, European, continental European or otherwise, with American religious fervor.
And I think we have to say it clearly. It's because of religious liberty in America, because there was no established church. I mean, if you have an established Catholic church in France, you can understand why people who hated the monarchy saw the monarchy as wedded to the establishment church. It was a source of power. It was an institution, whereas in the United States, there was no such thing. There was no established church. It was absolutely free.
And it was men like Thomas Jefferson, not an Orthodox Christian by any sense, a deist, one who believed in some sort of God, but who was the one who said, it's one of the things I talked about in the book is that we've twisted Jefferson now to say that he says separation of church and state, meaning we have to keep the church out of the state, religion out of politics. That is not at all what he said. It's not at all what he meant.
I mean, it's literally the opposite
It's
of
the
what he,
opposite.
yeah, which is a shocking thing.
Jefferson said, we do not want to impose the state upon religious liberties. We don't want the state in the churches financially supporting them, ordaining or appointing ministers. The idea was to ensure that minority religions, Christian religions, would flourish without the heavy hand of the state, which we'd seen in continental Europe. It was never intended to keep faith or religion or spirituality out of the public square or politics. And it was clearly the opposite. And in the 20th century, through the Supreme Court and other processes, that has been, as you said, completely inverted to mean the opposite of what it was intended to mean.
Father Richard John Newhouse, in 1984, wrote a book called The Naked Public Square, where he deals with this. He spoke at Socrates in the City, it's got to be about 15 years ago now, but he saw that when you get this wrong, and when you don't think that it's, the idea of the separation of church and state is to keep the state away from the church, to keep the church free, but you invert it and you say, no, it's to keep the idea of God or religion or faith away from anything we do in civic life, that you get the naked public square and you get enforced secularism, which undermines everything the founders knew necessary to genuine liberty.
That's absolutely right. And so what happens now, we're now, let's say, mid-1700s, on the eve of the Revolutionary War. Those two streams of ideas are coming together. They're finding a way to operate, I'm saying the Enlightenment and the Christian faith, a rejuvenated faith. And it forms the basis for the founders' ideals. So, for example, from the Enlightenment comes Montesquieu's idea from the Spirit of the Laws about the necessity of the separation of powers, that you had to keep the executive separate from the legislative, separate from the judicial. Why? Because power checks power. And that was the only way that you were going to have a balance of power that would keep the nation from devolving into tyranny, which was the great fear of that generation of leaders. They'd seen tyrannical oppression. They were experiencing it from the British colonial overlords. They'd seen it in other countries in Europe. And all of the ideas that James Madison and others express in the Declaration in particular and in the Constitution, again, this idea that all men are created equal, endued with unalienable rights that cannot be taken away or abridged by government. The ideas of the rule of law, that no king was sovereign above the law. Everyone was equal under the law. A fundamental idea that had been around for a long time but wasn't in practice really anywhere. The ideas of private property, what they described as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, the pursuit of happiness was this idea that you were free to enjoy what was yours, your land, your home, your possessions, your family, without the government coming in and taking any of those things away from you. The idea of the pursuit of happiness, if you look it up today in one of these contributive dictionaries, it's like the right to do whatever you want as long as it's not illegal and it doesn't hurt anybody. That is not at all what they meant. The pursuit of happiness was connected to the idea of virtue. It was a life well lived, but before it was written, pursuit of happiness in the Declaration, it was the idea of the right to private property, to have what the fruit of your labor, that the government would not take it away from you, as we see under any kind of authoritarianism or 20th century communism, or 21st century America, we could argue as well, but let's come back to that later and say that the idea that government had a wall, they were not allowed to encroach on your home. Even the Fourth Amendment under unlawful searches and seizures, that they could not come and take something without due process, without a warrant. All of those things were related ideas to the idea of the individual having sovereignty, having the ability to protect him or herself from the tyrannical oppression of government.
So yeah, there was a healthy fear of tyranny because it was so fresh. People had experienced tyranny. The founders had all experienced it under King George III. And that carries on. But it's interesting because even Lincoln, in his Lyceum speech in 1838, I mean, it's amazing. He's, 29 years old. And he delivers this extraordinary speech. Already in 1838, understanding that most of the revolutionary generation was dying out or had died out, and they were beginning to struggle with, because they hadn't lived through it with these ideas. And he felt the need, again, in 1838, a very long time before he becomes president, to try to reestablish what is America. And he's writing in 1838 about American exceptionalism and about how if we are to be destroyed, again, this is in 1838, it's amazing, that it's going to have to be by our own hand. And he talks about the silent artillery of time. Os Guinness wrote a book about it called A Free People's Suicide. But he is already seeing the danger of forgetting what we once all knew and how it has to be rehearsed over and over so that we don't forget it, not knowing that he himself would play a central role in that a couple of decades in the future. But it's fascinating to me that this goes back so far, that to forget the founders' vision was already a problem in the 1830s.
And in the 1830s, that generation was really coalescing around the idea of America. In other words, if you go back to the Revolutionary War, people more identified with their state. I'm from Connecticut. I'm from Virginia. Wherever it was, that was the stronger identity. By Lincoln's generation, this was shifting. There was an American myth. There was a story we tell ourselves about who we are. And it was a really beautiful thing, but he could see already, and by the way, even the previous generation could see that if we can't keep the Union together, if we can't figure out a way to get these colonies very different in nature and aspirations to work together in a union, we would be prey to our foreign adversaries. They saw it during the Revolutionary War. We had the British Empire fighting the French Empire, using the Americas as a battleground, trying to claim territory, seeing the vast wealth. The Founding Fathers knew, Lincoln knew, if you didn't hold together the nation as a nation, as a union, that we would be overwhelmed, divided, we would fall. During the Continental Congress, when they were trying to figure out what is going to go in the Constitution, the states were so divided that they made a terrible compromise on the issue of slavery. They couldn't hold the center. And the compromise pleased no one because the southern states were threatening to walk out of the Union altogether. The majority in the North decided, for that reason that I just explained, it was better to make a compromise and bring the South, keep the South in the union of the country, rather than have them walk. And so, rather than eliminate slavery altogether, which is what a lot in the North wanted, John Adams and others were advocating, Benjamin Franklin, who wanted to get slavery explicitly banned through the Constitution, they compromised, and they didn't do it, thinking that it would die under its own weight, that it was just such an evil thing that it would go away of its own power. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And the problem festered. So by the time the 1830s, when Abraham Lincoln is making that speech that you referenced, Andrew Jackson is in the White House, and he faces a crisis of South Carolina trying to set the stage to leave the Union already. It's called the nullification crisis. And they were basically created an act that said, whatever the federal government does, we can always nullify it. I'm simplifying, but we can basically, state sovereignty, we can take whatever federal law we don't like and nullify it and say that the state is sovereign. Well, Jackson recognized that this was step one towards their true aim, which was to secede from the Union. They could see the writing on the wall. They could see the conflict with slavery. They wanted out. South Carolina, other states would follow. So Jackson was effective because he stood his ground and he declared treason. He said that this is an insurrection, armed insurrection. He's going to send federal forces. Eventually, John Calhoun was in the Senate at the time, leading this charge. He had been Jackson's vice president and betrayed him and went down this rebellious path. But Jackson stood his ground, and South Carolina backed off. So Lincoln then credited Jackson 20 years later with having at least forestalled the Civil War and given at least an opportunity for 2 decades to try to see if there was another way out other than massive bloodshed. Ultimately, it failed, but this was on the path.
I mean, it is interesting to me that we're sitting in the Union League Club, founded in 1860, because of Abraham Lincoln and because whether we could keep the Union together was a central moment. There's a lock of John Brown's hair about 18 feet from where I'm sitting. There's a lot of history here. But most of us have forgotten the history. What you just said about the battle between John C. Calhoun and Jackson, I didn't know that until I read your book. So there's a lot of stuff in the book. How did you ferret these things out? In other words, what was it that made you, just in that case, because I thought everyone should know this. I'm glad you wrote about it, and I hope people will read Why America Matters. But how did you stumble on it and realize that it was so important?
And can I just pause the question for a second and just mention one thing that you said about the Union League Club and its history, and then I'll come back to it. Is one of my favorite rooms here in the Union League Club is the Grant room.
Yeah.
Well, why is that? I didn't know a whole lot about Grant before this process. The way I came to know Frederick Douglass and others, I came to know Ulysses S. Grant. And not only was he the greatest general that the North had, arguably the greatest general of all time, according to some historians, when Grant became president, Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson, had been put in place. He messed things up. He compromised with the South very badly. He was kicked out by his own party, impeached by his own party. Grant comes to power as President of the United States in '68, and he begins to enforce Reconstruction. So what had been happening in the meantime was the South had sort of reneged on all of its commitments around, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, giving Black Americans their freedom from slavery, their status as citizens, and ultimately the right to vote on paper, but not in practice. And essentially, the South was reverting to its old ways, to the black code and laws. Grant says no more, and he establishes the Justice Department, which is an institution that has fallen out of favor in our current day, but it was established in 1870 with a mandate. Its first mandate was to go break up the Ku Klux Klan. And within the first few months of Grant establishing it, there were indictments. The institution of the KKK was severely weakened. Federal troops were sent to the South at polling booths, voting booths, and Grant, alongside Lincoln, I now believe, and Douglass as a prophet and orator, were the most influential figures in this process of bringing America back to its core values, to its core roots. Now, ultimately, Grant is thrown out of office, and then we enter the Jim Crow era. And one of the saddest things as I was going through the history, reminding myself of the history, is how after all the loss of life, all the bloodshed, all the enslaved, by 1960, 4 million Africans, that we then, the tide went back out, and we lost so much ground during the Jim Crow era until, again, people like Martin Luther King and others had to reestablish what had already been fought for with blood.
Well, we have to remember, you talk about Grant waging war on the Ku Klux Klan. It's amazing to think that Joe Biden's dear friend in the Senate, Robert Byrd, was a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. This comes up into our own lifetimes. It's an amazing thing, the power of the Klan, the Dixiecrats, a vision in the South that many people have forgotten was pretty central to the power of the Democratic Party.
Let's be clear on this. I know you know this, but the KKK was the militarized arm of the party, of the Democratic Party. It was part and parcel with the Democratic Party, always was.
But the reason I value your book, Why America Matters, is many people don't know this. They've never heard this. And maybe even hearing it now, they think, what nonsense. That can't be right. Unfortunately, it is right.
It is right. It is right. And so I guess I want to come now to your question that you asked about, how did you find these things? What did you discover? It was very much a process of discovery. It was a rabbit hole. I threw myself into this. Couple sessions, couple of writing. You know how hard it is to write, and so I would do as much research as I could. I was having 2, 3 to 4 hour writing sessions a day, and trying to do everything else in life as well was not easy. But going all the way back to your first question, there was a fire to do it. There was just something where I felt like I needed to get this done. I needed to get this out there, and I was, to be honest, a bit ashamed and embarrassed that I had forgotten so much of what I had learned, and that there was so much that had been unlearned, that I had never appreciated, even if I had been taught it. And for me, certainly, it helped to pull the thread together of generations.
Well, I mean, sometimes things have to get very bad before you do something, and that's kind of what happened. It's happened to many Americans, and it happened in your life, that suddenly you think, wait a minute, we need to go back. And you rediscover American history, in a sense, and you retell it so wonderfully, Michael, in the book, Why America Matters. And kind of brings us to more recent times that, the title of the book is Why America Matters, the Case for a New Exceptionalism. What do you mean by new exceptionalism? I'm not clear on that.
So America has gone through, let's say, almost century-long periods of how it approaches the world. The first 100 years or so was one of isolationism. Having left the bloody conflicts of Europe, the view of, let's say, from the Revolution through the Civil War, certainly, or arguably through World War I, was, no thank you. We are going to focus here. We've got the frontier, the westward expansion. And the approach was very much internal. Now, of course, we were doing things in South America and elsewhere, but that shifts after the World Wars, where we realized, first of all, our industrial power had grown enormously during Reconstruction, that same period that Grant helped initiate. The standard of living went up like threefold, and the industrial power of the U.S. really grew between 1870 and the First World War enormously. It caught the world off guard as we were beginning to supplant other nations. During that period, we shift to expansionism, that we became more and more interested in what was happening outside of this country, some of it by necessity, some of it by design. And the consequence of that has been, I argue in this book, a shift from the idea of America as a nation to the idea of America as an empire.
Right. This is the key. This is a key point here in the book, and generally. What does it mean to be a nation? What does it mean to be a people? And when do you begin to strain beyond that, so that it's almost like your governing principle becomes an ideology divorced from your native soil? It becomes sort of a globalist ideology.
Well, empires can't have ideologies, because by definition they're agglomeration of different cultures, different languages, different tribes. What is a nation? The idea would be shared language, shared culture, shared values, shared. Doesn't mean they're all one race. You can be of many races, as America always was, and identify with the values of America, the foundational principles, speak a common language of understanding, which in our case was English. Empires abandon all that. In fact, nationalism becomes a threat to the empire, because you don't want people identifying around who they are as a people, as a language, or otherwise. And
so empires really have a kind of anti-ideology ideology. In other words, they're accusing, when we talk about American exceptionalism, they say they sneer, it's just nationalism, it's just chest-thumping tribalism, which of course it's not, and you make the case in the book that it's not, that it's a beautiful idea, it's a noble idea, but they sneer at it and they deride it as merely that, and they seem to be, when we talk about empire or American empire, it really becomes less about good ideology and more about bad ideology that pretends it's not ideology? I mean, the globalist idea, of course, it's an ideology.
The post-World War II America became an empire, certainly, and grew, and today we are now the global policeman. We were the global hegemon for a while before the rise of China following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union. But it is aligned with globalist ideology in the sense that the globalists do not believe in nation states. They don't believe in the sovereignty of nations or the sovereignty of the people. So empires are elitist, they're technocratic. The Roman Empire was a political movement, but it was also a religious movement. In other words, you had to subscribe to the unity of the political and religious empire, with the emperor being a god or a son of God. And that became your belief system, was the empire itself. Well, that's a very thin reed to lean on. Empires are incredibly expensive, and empires fall over time because of the inability to maintain loyalty or unity to an idea of a universal one, and because the cost of the empire is simply prohibitive. If you go around waging war all of the time to guard your empire, eventually, you were at Yale at the time when Paul Kennedy was there writing about the rise and fall of empires and other things, and that was, I think, the punchline for me of what Paul Kennedy wrote at the time, was that over time the costs outweigh the benefits enormously and the empire crashes upon itself. We are at that stage now, at 70, 80 years into the American empire. So try to answer your original question, a new exceptionalism means neither going back to 19th century isolationism nor to 20th century interventionism and empire. It is rediscovering who is America as a nation. We are in the middle of having our nation attacked from the outside and from the inside through ideology, through mass illegal immigration, which is absolutely tearing down the identities of this nation, through all the propaganda and lies, through institutions that can no longer be trusted by Americans because they are actively betraying us. I don't say here, oh, we just have to go back to the traditional past of America. We cannot go back. We're in the 21st century. We face 21st century problems. We face a rising China. We face a globalist system that wants to undermine our nation. And we face now what is no longer a fringe movement, but a very powerful ideological force within our own country that wants to destroy the values of America. The values of America are centered in a free and prosperous middle class, in a people that are sovereign, that make their own decisions. We're being undermined by an empire of endless war and perpetual conflict. And the very institutions that should be defending us are now attacking us.
Well, in a way, I think, if I remember what you say in the book, I mean, you're really calling for us to return to the founders' idea. In other words, it's the same exceptionalism, but we have to revisit it and then figure out how does that exceptionalism fit within the modern context.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
The ideals are eternal. The ideals of liberty. It was the ideas of the Christian gospel that said that in Christ we are all one, male and female, black, white, different races, poor and rich. That was radical. That there was no pagan or classical civilization that would believe any of those things were true. Jews and Gentiles and slaves and the rich, that somehow you were all created equal. Lincoln famously said, we don't mean equal in terms of height or intellect or ability. What we're saying is you have something given from God, not by any institution, and those freedoms cannot be taken away. We have to get back to those values, but it has to be form fit for the challenges of a 20th century, which includes a rising conflict with China, which includes the rise of AI and all the implications that will have for emerging society, et cetera.
Well, in the about 5 minutes that we have remaining, let me ask you the question, why does America matter? The question that you raise in the book. What is your answer to it? The book is titled Why America Matters. In your view, why does it matter?
Yeah. To me, I could list 1,000 reasons, and I do in the book, not 1,000, but I go through a list. If you ask me, why does it matter most? There's an adage that talks about God chose Israel, but the founders of the U.S. chose God. In other words, the foundational ideas we talked about, the Puritan ideal, was a nation that said, we are going to dedicate this nation to God. We're going to dedicate this to the principles of the faith.
Without establishing a religion.
Without establishing
without coercing
a state
it,
religion.
without using the law to force people to attend church or anything like that. We're not going to do that. Lincoln said famously that America was God's almost chosen people. He really understood that we couldn't be God's chosen people. Nonetheless, it would be very strange to look away from how we had been formed and what our obligation was, in a sense, in response to being the only nation in the world that was started with the idea of living out these biblical values.
And even today, in spite of all of the things that I do believe we have done wrong as an empire, we have been the defender of the faith. We have been around the world the defender of liberty. I tell the story about how in 1966 or somewhere around the mid-60s, Richard Wurmbrand, a Romanian pastor, testifies before the Senate about what had happened to him in the Soviet prison system because he would not renounce his faith in Jesus Christ. And the senators.
By the way, I had the privilege of meeting him. He was ethnically Jewish, persecuted horribly by the Nazis, became a believer in Jesus, persecuted very horribly by the communists. And so he makes his case in front of Congress.
Senate, and to add drama, he takes his shirt off
Yeah.
and shows them his back, laced with scars from whippings multiple times. His story is one of millions of people who have suffered under atheistic regimes around the world. Today, in China, millions of Christians are dying and being persecuted. Millions of Uyghurs, Muslims are dying and being persecuted under an atheistic, communistic regime. If America is no longer here, who defends those people? Who fights for those freedoms? So to me, for all the many, many reasons that America matters, the reason that matters most is that we are the defense of the faith of Israel, by the way, but also of the ideals of Christian liberty, the ideals of freedom. And we do more, you will be aware of this as well, that we're the most philanthropic nation in the world. We give to people, to churches, to ministries around the world, humanitarian aid like you wouldn't believe. Americans are so generous.
It's interesting. I'm looking at a lithograph of Lincoln right above your head here. Lincoln, again, put it famously, he called us the last best hope of earth. He understood American exceptionalism. He understood why America mattered then. It matters today for exactly the same reason. If you care about people being tortured or murdered in China, you have to look to America for the solution, which is an amazing thing when many in American leadership don't see. They don't frame it that way. But I mean, one of the reasons I think the book is so important is it makes the case in a way I think that most Americans would agree, would see it, but we just haven't really had the opportunity to hear it, to have it framed the way you framed it. Final thoughts before we close up here.
I think I really want to make sure to communicate what I communicated in the book, which is hope. I end the book by some very practical suggestions about what can we do as Americans. And I think in summary, the solution is not going to be tops down, it's going to be bottoms up, it's going to be grassroots. And even since the book was published, I've been so excited to see what's happening in America right now. Americans are waking up, they are rising up, they are resisting, they are becoming aware and more involved than ever before. We are in a period of discovery, of revelation, and I believe of real change right now. We're in a moment of crisis, absolutely, but I remain very optimistic that we are going to come out on the right side, that America is going to reaffirm itself as a nation, as a people, as a set of values, and that gives me hope.
Great place to end. Mike, I hate to praise people publicly. I usually make fun of people. That's my language. But I have to tell you, you've done a great thing in writing this book. Congratulations. It is titled Why America Matters, The Case for New Exceptionalism. Mike Wilkerson, author. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.